Hello, welcome to the Bible Standard. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comments area if you have any questions. We'll do our best to reply.
This series of studies has come about because it was suggested that, having done in the past studies on Judges and Joshua, which speak so eloquently of the work of our Lord Jesus Christ in the future, that perhaps we could do a series based on the books of Kings and Chronicles. And there are some wonderful things here, brothers and sisters, as we're going to see in the course of these studies, God willing. Now, this is not essentially a character study, but we are going to have to look at some of the characters involved, of course, which is why we've read from 1 of Kings chapter 16 and Omri and Ahab, who will play an important part in what follows. But I want to start with you in Amos chapter 9, if you wouldn't mind turning that up with me, Amos chapter 9 and verse 7. Now, this is a chapter which we are familiar with because of verse 11 and 12. The section of scripture that was quoted by James at the Jerusalem conference, circa AD 51 or thereabouts, which resolved a massive problem that had beset the brotherhood at that time. It was a time where the brotherhood of the first century had reached a crossroads, and there was a large group within it that were insisting that the Gentiles who had come into the faith would have to be circumcised and that they would have to keep the law of Moses. And all of the argument that went on didn't resolve the problem. Neither Peter or Paul or Barnabas were able to solve the problem, but James solved it by quoting Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. We won't go into that now, but that's the context in which we find ourselves in Amos chapter 9. The verse I want you to look at is verse 7, where we read, Yahweh says through the prophet, "Are ye not as children of the Ethiopians," it says in the King James. If you look that word up, it's Cush, Cushites, as you can see on the screen. "Are you not like unto the Cushites to me, O people of Yahweh, of Israel?" So here is Yahweh saying that his people had become like Babylonians, because the Cush being referred to here is the one of Genesis chapter 2. It's where ultimately they built the Tower of Babel. It's where, of course, the town or city of Babel came from. It's, of course, a reference back to the rebellion of Nimrod. And we're going to be talking a lot about the rebellion of Nimrod and his father Cush. They'll play a big part in what follows in this series of studies. Because, of course, when we read in 1 Kings 16 about Ahab introducing Baal worship into Israel, Baal means Lord or master. And, of course, it's a reference primarily to Nimrod. He was the first god king. He was, of course, the founder of the kingdom of men. He was the first Pontifex Maximus. And we're going to make reference to that in due course, because he's still around today in the form of the papacy, who was the Pontifex Maximus of Babylon the Great. And so we're going to see the connections between Genesis and Revelation in this series of studies. So here we've got in Amos 9 verse 7, Yahweh saying that as far as he was concerned, by this time of Israel's history, they were like Babylonians unto him. And he goes on to say, "Have not I brought Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir?" So at the very same time that God was bringing Israel out of Egypt, he was also bringing the Philistines from Crete to make them Israel's neighbours on the west. He was bringing the Syrians from Kir to make them Israel's neighbours on the east. And what he's really saying here, brothers and sisters, is I could have done better with uncircumcised Philistines and uncircumcised Syrians than what I did with circumcised Israelites. That's what he's saying. And that's why the context there is picked up by James. He picks up the language of verses 11 and 12 in Acts chapter 15 to resolve the Jerusalem conference, where the issue was that the Gentiles who had come into the faith had to be circumcised according to the law of Moses. So the point I want to make out of that is that we're going to have a look in this series at two Babylonian apostasies, one in Israel and one in Judah. And that's what we'll cover, God willing, today. Have a look at what we read in 1 Kings 16 and verse 32. Ahab reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And 200 years later, in 2 Kings chapter 21 and verse 3, Manasseh reared up altars for Baal and made a grove, as did Ahab, king of Israel. And that culminated when judgments fell on Judah. Because when Jeremiah, having advised the remnant who had survived the terrible event, the overthrow of Jerusalem in 587 BC, and he warned them not to go down to Egypt, they went down to Egypt, and on their way they were making statements like this. Jeremiah 44 verse 17. We will certainly burn incense, they said, unto the Queen of Heaven. You know who that was? That was Semiranis, the wife of Nimrod. So here they were on their way to Egypt, burning incense to Semiramis. And of course, perhaps even more horrifying, in Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 14, when the prophet Ezekiel was taken by the lock of his hair as a Nazarite from where he was in the area of Babylon to Jerusalem, he saw there women weeping for Tammuz. Now, Tammuz was the reincarnation of Nimrod, the son of Semiramis, who was illegitimate, by the way, because he wasn't Nimrod's son. So here we've got reference to Semiramis and to Tammuz. Now, this is going to play an important part as we proceed. I'm getting some feedback there. So many of you will have seen this chart of the chronology of the kings of Israel and Judah, also including the prophets. The top yellow line, of course, that bar is about the nation of Israel in the north, and the green line below it is the nation of Judah in the south. Israel went out of existence in 722 BC, the last king being Hoshea, and of course, Judah continued on till its overthrow in 587 BC. Now, you can see the red circle. That's the area that we're going to be focusing on in this study here today. And I want to start, as I said, it's not going to be a character study so much, but we're going to have to consider characters as we go along. We'll start with Elijah and Elisha as God's men for the times. And you'll see the reason for this when we get to the end of this study, because they play a very important part. Yahweh always raises up faithful men when the times demand it. It was a time of great turmoil in Israel, and as we read from 1 Kings 16, kings were frequently assassinated until a little bit of stability came along. Baasha slew Nadab, Jeroboam's son, 1 Kings 15:27. Zimri slew Elah, Baasha's son. He lasted for 1 week and then committed suicide. Civil war erupted in Israel, leading to an era of rank apostasy, because out of that civil war came a very strong and influential man called Omri. And we're going to see how important a part he plays, because Omri becomes the equivalent, as we're going to see from Micah 6:16 a little later, he becomes the equivalent in the scheme of things to Cush, the father of Nimrod. And Cush was the great original prophet of the Babylonian mysteries. He was the one who created the essence of the Catholic catechism of today. And you can check me out on that, because he was the great original prophet of the mysteries of Babylon. And so we're going to see the important part that he plays in the scheme of things. So this is the ministry of Elisha. You can see that circle, that oval shape there, encircling the time of Ahab through Ahaziah, Joram, and Jehu, and into the reigns of two more kings that flowed from Jehu. That was the period of Elisha. And that section that we just read from 1 Kings 16, the history of all of those assassinations and the trouble that led to the installing of Omri and his son Ahab as kings of Israel. So, Elisha was called in the reign of Ahab, and his ministry lasted until Jehoash some 50 years later. And Elisha actually performed Elijah's commission. So I'd like you to turn with me to the 1st of Kings chapter 19, and we will see in 1 Kings 19 the events that occurred, of course, at Mount Horeb, when Elijah went down there to plead with Yahweh to destroy Israel. We know that from Romans chapter 11. He went down there to plead with God to destroy Israel. Romans 11 verse 2. But of course, he goes through a series of events here that reshape his life. Now, Elijah performed only 2 of the tasks that were assigned to him by Yahweh at Horeb. And we're going to have a look at those because those 2 tasks were actually performed by Elisha. The only one of the 3, verse 16, if you have a look at verse 16 of 1 Kings 19, when he's told to go back to Israel, in verse 16 we read, "And Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel." Well, he didn't anoint Jehu, Elisha did. And it goes on to say, "And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room." He did actually do that, but that was the only one of the 3 commissions that he was given. He was to anoint Hazael, king of Syria. He was to anoint Jehu, king of Israel, but he didn't do it. In verse 16, Elisha also anointed Jehu as king over Israel because, of course, Jehu's name means Yah is he. Now, that's an interesting name, isn't it? Yah is he. And, of course, we know that Elisha, being a type of Christ, okay, is the one who will anoint, as it were, those who will assist him in the overthrow of the system of Babylon, the system that had been installed into Israel by Ahab. We'll come to that as we proceed. So Elijah anointed Elisha first. If you have a look at verse 19 of chapter 19 of the first of Kings, it says, "So he departed thence. He found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him." Now, we'll make a little bit of that phrase, "pass by," in a moment. But, of course, he cast his garment on him. Now, Elisha came from a place called Abel Meholah, the meadow of dancing. As you can see there, it's in the Jordan Valley, and it's 16 kilometres for those who use kilometres, 10 miles south of Bethshan in the Jordan Valley. And it's about 20 kilometres or 15 or so miles from Tishbe. Now, Tishbe, of course, was where Elijah, the prophet, came from. So this is where the anointing of Elisha as a prophet in Elijah's room occurred. He was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, which is clearly, isn't it, clearly a reference to the tribes of Israel. And so he was to be a prophet, as it were, to all of those tribes, whereas Elijah was only a prophet to Israel. And the mantle that was thrown over the shoulders of Elisha as he ploughed with his 12 yoke of oxen is a symbolic reference to prophetic office. And we know that from Zechariah 13 verse 4, where it mentions that even in the future after Armageddon, there will be those who try and assume the office of prophets, and they'll be false prophets. And it says in that passage that they will wear a rough garment, which is what Elijah wore. He wore a rough garment. And so it becomes a symbol of his prophetic office. So let's have a look what happens at the end of this chapter, because when he's anointed, as it were, with the garment of Elijah being placed on his shoulders, it says in verse 20, "And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, Go back again, for what have I done to thee?" Now, Elisha's request to say farewell to his parents is the basis, of course, of Luke chapter 9. Verses 61 and 62. And in fact, the Lord refers to this incident in Luke chapter 9. Now, I'm not going to take you there for the sake of time, but I think you're familiar with it. There are 3 disciples who approach the Lord, and all of them are making excuses of one kind or another. And it's very important to notice in Luke chapter 9 the word first, because 2 of them use that word. "Let me first go and bury my father." And the Lord, of course, says, "Let the dead bury their dead." Another one comes along and he says, "Look, let me first go and say farewell to my parents now, or my family." He's making an excuse, and Christ knew that. So he says to that one, "If you put your hand to the plough and you turn back, you're not worthy of the kingdom." So what we have here in 1 Kings 19 is the basis of that. Now, farewells in ancient times invariably lasted for weeks or sometimes months. We know that from Genesis 24, verse 55. We know it from Judges chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. They took a long time to say farewell. So that man in Luke 9, he was really saying, Lord, I'd like to follow you, but I've got a few other things to do. And it might take me weeks or months. Delay was clearly the motive of the man in Luke 9:61. Let me first go bid them farewell at home. However, it's different here in 1 Kings 19. Elijah knew that delay was not Elisha's motive. And did you notice that Elijah, when he put his rough garment on Elisha, just kept on going? Do you see that in the record? He didn't stand there waiting for a response from Elisha. He just kept on going. He passed by, it says. Very important words, as you'll see a little later on. So Elijah knew that Elisha was not making an excuse. He says to him, go back again, or as Rotherham and Young's literal translate it, go, turn back. That is, he gave him permission. Christ did not give permission to the disciple in Luke chapter 9. And then the words follow, which are a little bit difficult to understand in the King James. For what have I done to thee? The companion Bible says, consider what is the meaning of what I did to you. So Elijah exhorts Elisha to consider the importance of what he had done, and Elisha knew what he had done. He'd been appointed to take over the work of Elijah the prophet. And in verse 21, he sacrifices with the people using the instruments of his old occupation, but there's no mention there of his father or mother. He probably did say farewell, but that wasn't important, really important to him. The importance was that he would take over a very important teaching role in Israel. A role that Elijah, of course, had not accomplished. The Lord's final words on that is, no man having put his hand to the plough and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. That phrase pass by, it connects the record of Moses on Mount Horeb in Exodus 33, verses 21 to 23, and again in 34, verse 6, with that of Elijah on the very same mountain and probably in the same cave of 1 Kings 19, verses 9 to 14. It also links the above events with the call of Elisha to service in Elijah's stead, as we saw in 1 Kings 19 to 21, and all of the above laid the foundation for the events of the Transfiguration, in which Moses and Elijah passed by. And finally, even the bright cloud that overshadowed Christ and his three disciples on the mount, even the bright cloud and the voice, we read in Luke chapter 9, passed by so that Jesus was found alone. And there he was, the Word made flesh of John 1:14. Now, that's an entirely different subject, of course, but it's important to recognise where that language that is used of the Transfiguration comes from. It gives you the reason why Moses and Elijah were there and not David and Abraham or other characters of the past. They were there because of the lessons that were learnt in that very same cave on Mount Horeb. And we'll be talking a little bit about those lessons as we proceed. So Elijah and Elisha as types. Well, Elijah, of course, was a type of John the Baptist who came, as we read in Luke chapter 1, verses 15 to 17, he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. Elisha was a type of Christ, the still small voice of God in Israel, as we will see a little later. Elijah's work was primarily about warning of impending judgment, but was to include teaching just like John the Baptist. Though Elisha's mission included acts of judgment, it was primarily about education and spiritual guidance of Israel. Now, we'll see the importance of those things as we proceed. What about the apocalypse in the Kings? When Christ used Jezebel to describe the rise of apostasy in the Ecclesia at Thyatira, he gave a clue as to how the times of Ahab and Jezebel should be read prophetically. Now, let me say, brothers and sisters, I know on the basis of having done these studies before, that this first study is probably the most challenging of the 5 that we will undertake this weekend, God willing. But if you can stick with me, you will see, I believe, some wonderful things that emerge from the Kings in relation to the future. Jezebel modelled herself on Semiranis and brought Baal, that is Cush and Nimrod, as we're going to see, they play a very important role, brought Baal, who represent Cush and Nimrod, worship into Israel. the destruction of Ahab's house, the death of Jezebel, and the annihilation of Baal worshippers prefigured the events of the 40-year judgment period beyond Armageddon. Now, a little later on, at the end of this study, I'm going to show you a chart which actually sets out those things. In the events that occur, we're going to see how prophecy was inherent in the history of the kings, particularly this matter of Ahab and the destruction of his house. Let's then come to Revelation 2. Now, when you see on the screen, you see that yellow bar underneath the reference. It's because I'm going to take you there, and some of you will beat me there. Revelation chapter 2, verses 18 to 29. And I'm sure that those online can hear a few ding-dongs going on. That's because we're in a place where if you enter the front gate, that's what happens. Ecclesia Thyatira had a problem, huge problem. So in Revelation 2, verse 18, we read Christ's letter to them. Unto the angel of the Ecclesia in Thyatira write, These things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. I know thy works, and love, and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works. That's interesting, there's a second reference to works. And the last to be more than the first. I think we need to take note of that. Notwithstanding, I have, and then the words, few things, can be omitted because they're not apparently in the better texts, because he's only got one thing against this ecclesia. They had plenty of works. He even says that they had faith and patience, but they had a problem. He says, I have against thee because thou sufferest that woman, Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. So he commends this ecclesia for works, love and service, faith and endurance, and even more works, which I think when you reflect upon it tells us that their focus was on doing and not on doctrine. It needed to be on both. They are criticised for the toleration of a seducing Jezebel class. Now it says, doesn't it, that Jezebel seduced my servants to commit fornication. She did that literally. In other words, because the worship of Baal included sexual promiscuity, of which he was a master, she had 400 boyfriends, of course. She knew all about that, and she seduced her servants of the kingdom of Ahab to get involved in the kind of thing that she was doing. Here, of course, in Revelation, the Lord is using that as being typical of teaching wrong doctrine. Teaching wrong doctrine that would, of course, end up in disaster for the members of that ecclesia if it wasn't terminated. And that's what he asked them to do. As you read on, he says, verse 21, I gave her space to repent of her fornication. She repented not. Behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation. In other words, if they get involved in her false teachings, except they repent of their deeds, and I will kill her children with death, which is what happened, of course, to the house of Ahab. And he goes on to say in verse 24, And unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden. He only has one thing that he wants them to do, to eject the teachers of error from their midst. So that's the requirement. And there's a promise given that if they do that, if they hold fast in verse 25, till I come, he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. And then comes a quotation, as we'll see later on, from Psalm 2. Psalm 2, of course, is very important in relation to the theme of this study. But we'll reserve that until a little bit later. So why was judgment impending upon this ecclesia? Well, because of apostasy. And of course, we know, sadly, that apostasy was not overcome within that ecclesia and in others. So we have what's called, in our writings, the Thyatiran epoch. AD 606 to 1572, when true witnessing came to an end. And Jezebel was ascendant in the Christian, using that, of course, in the widest sense of the term, the apostate Christian system, which, of course, was led by the Catholic Church, that had come out of the brotherhood. And it's very important to always remember that. As Brother Thomas stresses in Eureka, the Catholic system came out of the brotherhood. And it was, of course, things like this that were happening in that Ecclesia at Thyatira that ended up with that system flourishing. Of course, we have the papal system today, which is the outcome of what happened way back then. So what do we learn from that? Without purity of doctrine, there is no salvation. Paul makes that very plain. 1 Timothy 4:12-16. Now, I'm not going to take you to these passages, obviously, because time will beat us. But I think we're all familiar with that. You have to have purity of doctrine if you want salvation. Allowing error to be taught as they were in the Ecclesia at Thyatira results in shipwreck. Paul says that in 1 Timothy 1:19-20, where he identifies two brethren who were teaching that the resurrection was already past. So wrong doctrine creates shipwreck of the faith. And proven teachers of error must be rejected. Paul makes that very plain to Titus in Titus 3 verses 1-11, and of course to the Galatians in Galatians 1 verses 8 and 9. It has to be dealt with properly. There has to be thorough investigation. There has to be every effort made, but once they are proven teachers of error, they must be rejected. And that is exactly what Christ is asking of the Ecclesia at Thyatira. Get rid of Jezebel, the Jezebel class in your Ecclesia. Otherwise, there will be disaster. And guess what? They didn't, and they don't exist today. They haven't existed for a long time because they did not get rid of the teachers of error. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second because everything that I've said thus far has led us to this. Now that we've got a little bit of background on Elijah and Elisha, a little bit of background on Omri and Ahab, we need now to dig a bit deeper. This is where it can get a little bit complicated for some people. So I'm going to take you through this steadily. We'll see how we go. So let's have a look then at the left-hand side of this chart. You've got the red bar. This is, of course, the reigns of Omri, followed by the reign of Ahab, who takes Jezebel from the Sidonians up the north, and she becomes an absolute figure of apostasy. She's the one, of course, that encourages Ahab, as we will see a little later on, to cement Ahab's adopted Baal worship in Israel. Then you've got at the end of that red bar, you'll see Athaliah. Now, she was definitely the daughter of Ahab. The way she acts, she's probably the daughter of Jezebel, although we don't have any direct record of that. I don't think there's any doubt that she is the daughter of Jezebel. But then Jezebel wouldn't know, of course, who was the father of any of her children because she had so many partners. Let's look at this Omri. Now, you see there reference to Micah chapter 6 and verse 16 on the screen. He was the builder of Samaria, and you might recall that record of 1 Kings 16 where it said that when he had defeated all of his opposition in the civil war that had racked Israel for a couple of years, quite a few years in fact, it says that he reigned in Tirzah, which was the previous capital, and he went and bought in verse 24 the hill of Samaria of a man called Shema. And he built a city there which became the capital of Israel for the rest of its history. And he named it after the man from whom he bought it, Samaria. And then it says in the record that Omri was the worst king that Israel had had up to that time. He was to be exceeded by his son Ahab. It didn't take very long before he lost that status as being the worst king of Israel. I want you to come to Micah 6 and verse 16. We have a formula here which is very important. Remember, of course, that Micah is also condemning Israel and Judah. He's condemning them for Baal worship, for the corruption that had been introduced by Ahab and was introduced into Judah by Manasseh. And we read there in verse 16 of Micah chapter 6, "For the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab. And ye walk in their counsels, that I should make thee a desolation, and the inhabitants thereof an hissing. Therefore ye shall bear the reproach of my people." Now, that's a very important verse because it provides a formula that takes us right back to Cush and Nimrod. When you go back to Genesis 10 and verse 8, you read that Cush begat Nimrod. And Nimrod became a mighty hunter in the face of Yahweh, that is, in a contest with Yahweh. He was in Yahweh's face. He was going to take over God's kingship. And he did. He became the first God king by overcoming the problem of the wild animals that Yahweh had unleashed upon the people. After they'd come out of the ark, of course, they had a measure of control. We read that in Genesis chapter 9. "The animals will be subject unto you," said Yahweh to Noah. Well, of course, what he meant was until, of course, sin again dominates the world. And then he unleashed the wild beasts against them. And if you read the record of Genesis chapter 10, we are told that Nimrod created 2 mega cities. He chose 4 towns. The first mega city was based on Babel. He chose another 3 towns, probably in a sort of like a rectangular shape. He built a wall between them, and he protected his people from the wild beasts that were a problem to them. That not being adequate, he then went to Nineveh. He used that as his primary base in Genesis chapter 10, and you read that. He went to Assyria. He created this second mega city. And same thing, he got 4 towns. He built walls between those four towns, which kept the wild animals away. So his people said, well, he's done what God did for Noah and those who came from the ark. He's protected us from the wild beasts. He must be God. So Nimrod becomes the first God king of the earth, the founder of the kingdom of men. Now, for those of you who doubt what I've just said, read the book of Jonah. Because when Jonah came to Nineveh, it says that he went 3 days' journey into the city. Now, 3 days' journey is 60 miles. Well, it's telling us that he still wasn't on the other side of the city, because you see, the city was regarded as being that 4 square rectangle. It was a city, a very large city. It was at least 60 miles across. So what we have here is Nimrod's mega city, which made him the god of the earth. And I use that phrase deliberately because when we get in a moment to Revelation chapter 11, you're going to see that it makes reference to Nimrod's successor, the Pope. So that's the background here. Cush was the father of Nimrod. And as I said earlier, he was regarded as the great original prophet of the Babylonian mysteries. So Omri becomes like Cush. He's the statute maker. The statutes of Omri are kept. And it was his son who played out, who fulfilled the statutes of Omri. Ahab actually goes out and does all of the things that Omri had created. It's exactly what happened with Cush and Nimrod. And so Nimrod becomes the one who fulfills the statutes of Cush. I hope that makes a little bit of sense to you. Okay, well, I've gone a little bit slower than what I normally do because if we don't kick this off and get that straight up front, maybe the rest is not going to make a lot of sense. So shall we move on then? Let's go to the next step here. Look at Ahab, the restorer of Baal worship and founder of the apostate religion that corrupted the whole nation of Israel. He was the implementer of the ideologies of Omri, the builder of Canaanite worship. Again, I say again because I'll come back to Jericho a little later on. Jericho was the very heart and centre of Baal worship in the land of Canaan when Israel came into it. So here we've got Ahab being the implementer of the statutes of his father. So come back to 1 Kings 16 with me. Let's just again have a look at the record here of Jezebel. We picked this up from verse 30. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of Yahweh above all that were before him. So he takes away from his father that dubious honour of being the worst king of Israel. And he couldn't have done any worse than what he did. Verse 31. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, which, by the way, every single king of the northern kingdom of Israel did, every one of them, even the sons, or even Jehu and his sons, who reigned for 4 generations, they all simply followed the pattern of Jeroboam I. It says, if that had been a light thing, he took to wife Jezebel. Now her name means chaste. This is probably the greatest misnomer of the Bible. She was exactly the antithesis of chaste. As I said, she had 400 prophets. She wouldn't let them go up onto Mount Carmel to contest with Elijah because they were her boyfriends. Allow that. So here she is. She's the daughter of Baal, and Baal means with or near Baal. She never left him. Never left him. And she was responsible for the restoration of Amoritish worship in Israel. Now, just a few pages further on in our Bible, in 1 Kings 21 and 25 and 26, you get the evidence of that. 1 Kings chapter 21. This is the occasion, of course, this chapter is about the vineyard of Naboth and the horrendous acts of Jezebel in getting rid of not only Naboth, but his sons as well. In 1 Kings 21 at verse 25, this is Yahweh's estimation of Ahab. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did set himself to work wickedness in the sight of Yahweh, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. Now that's a very interesting word in the Hebrew. That word stirred there is suth, C-U-W-T-H, and it means to prick, to stimulate, from the root that comes from the word briars or thorns. You know, briars and thorns in your side and in your eyes. You know the language. When Israel came into the land, they were warned about the Canaanites, that they would be briars and thorns. And of course, it was like Jezebel had some kind of hat pin or some kind of prodding instrument, and she kept on prodding Ahab. You know, do this, do that, do this. She ruled that kingdom. She proved that in this chapter. She said, are you king of Israel? You can't acquire the vineyard of Naboth? Leave it to me. And we know what she did. So let's read on. It says in verse 26, and he did very abominably in following idols according to all things as did the Amorites, whom Yahweh cast out before the children of Israel. So Amorite worship was restored in Israel. Now come back to 1 Kings 16, because there's a final verse in this chapter which is critical. I'm just going to read, before I get to verse 34, I'm just going to read what we haven't read out of verse 31. He took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Baal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove. Now that word grove in the Hebrew is Asherah. She was the goddess of fertility. Guess who she was based on? Semiranis, the first mother of harlots. Jezebel becomes a mother of harlots. He made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke Yahweh, God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. Now, why is verse 34 there? In his days, it says, did Hiel, the Bethelite, build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spake by Joshua, the son of Nun. Now, the reference there is to Joshua chapter 6 and verse 26. And I'm going to read it to you. Joshua chapter 6 and verse 26. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before Yahweh that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. So Yahweh was with Joshua, etc. So that's the reference that's made in 1 Kings 16 verse 34. Question is why? Well, because you see, Jericho was the only city in the land of Canaan that was devoted to utter destruction. And the reason for that was that it was the hometown, the centre of Baal worship in the land of Canaan. It had to be utterly and totally destroyed, like the system it represented, the Roman Catholic harlot system. And that's why the man who rebuilt it lost all of his sons. He put up, he laid the foundation in his oldest son. He might have had a dozen sons, we don't know. But he lost them all. And all the adherents of that system will be destroyed out of the earth. The system of Cush and Nimrod. They're going to be eradicated from the earth. They're not going to have any heritage like this man who rebuilt Jericho. And you might remember that when Achan confessed his sin, when he told, in verse 21 of chapter 7 of Joshua, he told Joshua and the nation, he said, When I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonian garment. If you've ever looked up that word, Babylonian, you will find that it's Shinar. And Shinar is the Hebrew form of the name Semiranis, the wife of Nimrod. So here we've got a goodly Shinar garment. It came from Babylon. Guess what colour it was? Red. Because you see, Semiramis had two sections in her priesthood. She had the inner circle, the ones who could go into her presence. They wore a red garment. She had an outer circle of priests who burnt the sacrifices, and that's why they wore black garments, so they didn't get charcoal on their clothing. And the Roman Catholic system has an inner circle of cardinals who wear a red garment. You know what cardo means? Cardo, the Latin word from which we get cardinals, means the hinge of a door. And Semiramis's inner circle of priests controlled the door. They controlled access to her, the mother of harlots. So this is why when you see the background in 1 Kings 16, and you see that the last verse of that chapter takes you back to Joshua chapter 6 and the sin of Achan, you see why it's there. The restoration of Baal worship that was centered in Jericho is now back in the land of Israel. Okay, we can move on. We've got Omri, the city builder and the statute maker. We've got Ahab, the rebuilder of Baal worship and founder of the apostate church. We've got Jezebel, the mother of harlots and teacher of Baal worship, spiritual adultery, as was going on in the Ecclesia at Thyatira. She's the type, of course, of the Roman Catholic apostasy arising out of the brotherhood, just as we read in Revelation 2, verses 20 to 23. Now I want to turn to quite possibly her daughter, certainly the daughter of Ahab. Her name is Athaliah. And you see that bar under that reference to 2 Chronicles 22? I want you to come to 2 Chronicles 22. Now, this is the fascinating thing about Scripture, isn't it? It really explains itself. In 2 Chronicles 22, we have the record of the only surviving son of the idiot Jehoram, who murdered his own brothers and lost all of his children because of his apostasy. And you come to verse 2 of 2 Chronicles 22, the King James Version doesn't make a great start because it says 42 years old. Now, that's an impossibility. And in the companion account, it tells us that Ahaziah was 22. So it should read, 22 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri. Stop. Whose daughter was she? She was the daughter of Ahab. So why does it say that she was the daughter of Omri? This is where we need to go back. We need to remember Micah chapter 6, verse 16. The statutes of Omri kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab. They were their counselors. Right? Omri is the counselor. So read on here in 2 Chronicles 22. We've been told something that's not accurate. She was the daughter of Ahab, but she's called here the daughter of why? He also walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to do wickedly, Micah 6, verse 16. Wherefore he did evil in the sight of Yahweh like the house of Ahab, for they were his counselors. The statutes of Omri are being kept. They were his counselors after the death of his father to his destruction. So Athaliah takes over. And what we now have in Judah, of course, is the same apostasy that had come into Israel. Through the foolishness, of course, of Jehoshaphat, who made an alliance with Ahab. So let's keep going. We've got Elijah, the messenger of the covenant. Because you see, I want you to come to Revelation 11 to see where this all ends up. Elijah is the messenger of the covenant and the religious witness against the apostate church. Revelation 11 begins a series of chapters, 11 to 13, which tells us the development of the Roman Catholic system out of the brotherhood. In fact, in verse 7 of this chapter, that you read for the first time the word beast, because what's going to arise out of these chapters is the development of the Roman Catholic apostasy. I'm going to read from verse 1 of Revelation 11. There was given unto me a reed like unto a rod, so it's about persecution, a time of persecution which is measured out, as we shall see. And the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and them that worship therein, and that hopefully includes us all, because it's about the true ecclesia, but the court without, that which came from the brotherhood, which is now an apostate system, the court which is without the temple, leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city, that's the true ecclesia, shall they tread under foot 42 months. Now, 42 months, of course, is 3.5 years. How long was the ministry of Elijah? Well, the duration of the famine, where there was no rain. He burst upon the scene in 1 Kings 17 and he said, by the word of Yahweh, there will be no rain for 3.5 years. So 1,260 days or 42 months is 3.5 years, the length of the ministry of Elijah. Because you remember, at the end of that, he flees. He flees to Horeb. That's the end of his work. It only lasted for 3.5 years. And then Elisha took over from him. So let's work out what we're reading here at the end of verse 2. What's this 42 months refer to? Well, it refers to the period of papal ascendancy from the decree of Focus, decrees which were made between 608 and 610 AD, to the loss of the Pope's temporal power in 1868 and 1870, when Garibaldi came up from Naples and ultimately pushed the Pope out of Rome. He lost control of the states over which he ruled. He was sent into exile. He lost what is called temporal power, power over land and people. He was restored again with the 100 acres that were given to him by Il Duce in 1929, Mussolini, who created the Vatican State, which is a separate nation to Italy. All right, so it was restored to him again in 1929. But it was lost in 1870. That's that period of 42 months, or 1,260 years in biblical terms, 3.5 years prophetically. Then you read on in verse 3, and I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So here we've got another 1,260 days or 60 years on the day for a year principle. And this is the period from 312 AD, when Constantine overthrew Maxentius and created in the Roman Empire the Christian religion, okay, down to 1572, when effective witnessing came to an end with the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in France. So you've got a similar period, different start date, obviously, but a similar period, 3.5 years. So what do we read about them? Verse 4, these are the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth. The God of the earth is the successor to Nimrod. The Pontifex Maximus, that was Nimrod's title. And if you go into the Vatican, if you've been to the Vatican, as I have, and you walk around that incredibly marvellous building, and you see the shiny marble, every few yards you come across a circle, and it's to Pope Leo. We've got a Pope Leo now, haven't we? Pope Leo the 14th. And behind his name, Pope Leo, or whatever the name of the Pope was, is the letters PM. Doesn't mean Prime Minister, right? It means Pontifex Maximus, the successor to Nimrod. He's the God of the earth. And Nimrod was the first God king, the founder of the kingdom of men. And it goes on to say in verse 5, if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devoureth their enemies, and if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed. These have power, look at verse 6, these have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, 3.5 years, just like Elijah stopped it raining through the power of God for 3.5 years. So God would be with his witnesses. Elijah was the religious witness. And he had, alongside of him, even though he didn't recognize it, a political witness. The 2 witnesses are religious and political opposition to Rome and its religion. And Obadiah, remember the right-hand man of Ahab, whom Elijah did not recognize? He was the political witness. He was working against the apostate system of Jezebel to save Yahweh's prophets from being murdered by her. He was inside the government, and he worked against that persecuting harlot. So you can see where all that comes from, can't you? You can see where it comes from. Now, I see that I've gone over time. I just want to go through this chart, if you don't mind. There's a bit more I was going to say, but unfortunately, time has escaped me. Have a look at this chart. You know the history, brothers and sisters. When Elijah was on Mount Carmel, he called down fire from heaven. That's the language of Armageddon. Fire from heaven on Mount Carmel prepared Israel for their conversion, just like Armageddon will. If you go to Matthew 24, verse 30, you read about the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And we don't have to argue about what that means, because it's picked up in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. And we are told by Christ what it means in Revelation 1 verse 7. It's about Armageddon. You and I are going to be involved in that. Then let's look at the next little thing on this chart. Jezebel is killed a little later by Jehu, whom Elisha anoints. And Rome will be destroyed. The city of Rome, the centre of Catholicism, will be destroyed 10 years after Armageddon. Very careful study of Revelation 14 will tell you that, verse 8 in particular. And the preceding verses that talk about the message, the mid-heaven proclamation that goes out before Rome is destroyed. And we know that will be 10 years. Then you've got the house of Ahab annihilated by Jehu. And Babylon the Great will be destroyed over 30 years. Revelation 14 verses 9 to 11 will tell you that. Then you've got Baal worshippers in Israel annihilated by Jehu. So the false prophet and ardent Catholics who insist on supporting the papacy will be destroyed. Now, as I said, a little bit more to say, and I'm not going to have time to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you, not even to that. Isn't it a pity that we can't do that? But anyway, I'm going to take you here, Revelation 19. I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse, and the horse is Israel. Proof? Isaiah 63 verse 13. That's where this language is coming from. The one who destroys Edom, latter-day Babylon the Great, and that can be proven very easily. So, how was Jezebel killed? Well, she was trampled by horses, wasn't she? Trampled by horses. And Christ is going to ride a white horse, and behind him, the saints will be on white horses themselves. So he goes forth to destroy that system. And the beast, the revived Holy Roman Empire, as Brother Thomas correctly says in Eureka, was taken, and with him the false prophet, the papacy that wrought signs before him, and they're thrown into the lake of fire burning with brimstone. That, brothers and sisters, is our role of the future. And I'm going to take you, and you can see, you can get these slides later on if you wish. I want to take you to the final passage I want to quote. It is based on Revelation 2, 26 and 27. I want you to come to Psalm 2, and we will finish on this particular passage. Psalm 2 is all about the revolt of the Catholic nations after Armageddon. That's very obvious when you read this psalm. So let's get to Psalm 2. Let's read verse 1. Why do the heathen or the nations rage, and the peoples imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his Messiah. Mashiach is the word. Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. Yahweh, as it should read, shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. What time is this? When is this happening? Well, we know from verse 6. Yet have I set, notice the tense, yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. That's going to happen immediately after Armageddon and the great earthquake which reshapes that land and that city. And there's a declaration that goes out about from this king who's set upon the throne. What is it? Verse 8, ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. And if you look on the screen, guess where the words from Revelation 2, 26 and 27 are coming from? From Psalm 2, 8 and 9. He shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessels of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. And I will give him the morning star. Brothers and sisters, that's our future. That's the reward for those who stand aside from that system. They are not defiled with women, as Revelation 14 verse 4 says. They're not defiled with other religious systems, especially that system. That's our reward if we remain faithful to the end.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching. And remember to come back soon.